Good evening. Welcome, everybody, to Lead with Giants TV. Tonight's guest is Greg Bustin. He is the author of Accountability, the Key to Driving High Performance Culture. He is here in Dallas. Welcome, Greg. How are you?
I'm fine, Tal. Thank you.
Now, are you enjoying this nice weather? Because you've got a sweater on, so I wasn't sure if you kind of picked outside at all today.
Well, I haven't been outside since this morning. Our daughter lives in Chicago. I already got a text from her saying, "I can't believe it's 70 in Dallas." She's still in snow boots up there.
All right. As long as you don't show her what kind of snow we've got, we're good in shape.
That's right. We're good.
Well, thank you so much for joining us, and for I know we've got a great audience of leaders who are watching this show, and our topic is accountability. I do have the book in front of me because it's a great book. You've got to get it. It's right here. It's got a really great stories and experiences and tools and strategies that Greg has been working on for how long now, Greg?
Well, I started researching the book about 5 years ago, but it's certainly I've dedicated a career to working with leaders, and this book is a reflection of that.
Great. And some local companies like Container Store and Southwest Airlines are in that book. So we've got some combination, and as well as Marriott, so hospitality, customer service, some of those companies. But let me introduce Greg to our audience. Just for those of you who don't know him, I'm sure you'll get to know him through the show. But Greg is a business consultant and a speaker, has dedicated a career to working with CEOs and leadership teams of companies about accountability. As he said, over the last 5 years, he's interviewed and surveyed more than 3,200 executives around the world from companies such as Marriott, Container Store, Ernst & Young, Sony, Herman Miller, and Southwest Airlines to understand how high-performing corporations successfully create and sustain a culture of purpose, trust, and fulfillment. So it's a great pleasure to have you. I know accountability is it's a big topic everywhere you go, and could have not asked for a better expert on the subject.
Well, thank you very much for having me this evening.
Great. So let's get started. Why do we have such a problem or a hard time with accountability in many organizations?
Well, as I got into it, I found there's no silver bullet. And as I talked to these leaders, and I also talked with leaders at small and mid-sized companies, and what I found was that this culture where it's really built on purpose and trust, and organizations that are successful at building this kind of culture use accountability really more as a support system for winners rather than as punishment. But I think that one of the things that makes it so hard, and I introduce what I call the 7 pillars of accountability: character, unity, learning, tracking, urgency, reputation, and evolving. What I say is it's really a system, it's really a culture, and there's really no silver bullet. But the closest thing to a silver bullet that we often get wrong is that we are not specific enough up front. One of the things that I like to say, Tal, is that clarity creates confidence. So the more clarity we have about what we want, the more clarity we have about where we're trying to take our department or our division, our team, our organization, then the more confident everyone can be in terms of understanding what needs to get executed. And so I think really one of the breakdowns is that we don't have that clarity, because what I learned, and you would think that this would be obvious, is that before we can hold others accountable, we first have to hold ourselves accountable. And it's hard to hold ourselves accountable when we don't have that clarity in terms of, is this what I really want? Am I having fun? Is this fulfilling my purpose at work? So those are some of the things that make it hard. But once we get those things figured out, then accountability is it's a lot more fun, frankly.
And I agree with you. Sometimes what happens, and I guess, I think that we all get into an organization or get into a company, and accountability is usually associated with results, performance management, those balanced scorecards, how did we do, and then getting those, I guess tangibles is probably a better word, tangible to associate accountability and hold that manager accountable and the leader accountable. And you talked about clarity, so explain how clarity kind of helps to get to their results.
Well, yeah, I think that you're right. When we generally think, and this was certainly true for me when I was running a division and then an office of an international firm and then later my own organization. What I found was that accountability often looked like the conversation that I didn't want to have
Hmm.
after someone had not done something that I wanted them to
Right,
do.
right.
And so what I found was that if we could get north of that conversation, if we could be really clear about what kind of values, what kind of principles matter in our company, then we can attract the kind of people into our clubhouse that are already aligned around the same beliefs, around the same values. And when you have that, then it means that those winners don't want to let other winners down. And so I think that when you start from that perspective, then the rest of it just happens to follow. So what I say is let's get really clear about what we stand for. Let's hire and make sure that we keep and promote and reward those folks that are consistent with those values. And when you do that, you're off to the races.
Hmm. And, share maybe an example or two of how that works in real life. The reason I say this is because I think a lot of us as leaders and being managers in company, we see that sometimes theoretically, but we don't
Right.
see, we see the values, we see the mission statement, we see all these warm and fuzzy buzzwords. But share an example of how that worked in some of your research.
Well, so you mentioned Southwest Airlines is a company that we talked with, and they have three very simple, powerful, compelling values. It's warrior spirit, servant's heart, fun-loving attitude, and they hire people according to that. And what they told me is a couple of things. Number one, you can't fake those things, right? You can't
Hmm.
teach someone to smile. You can't teach someone necessarily to go the extra mile. And the other thing that they said, and this was similar to a number of the companies that I spoke with, is that they said, we love you enough to tell you the truth. And I think that
Hmm.
one of the things that happens with accountability is that we see it, but we don't say it. And so we have a conversation with ourselves. And instead of just saying, look, I want to tell you this, not because I'm trying to tear you down, not because I'm trying to make you feel bad. What I'm wanting you to know is that I'm here for you to be successful, and this how you're performing here is not going to contribute to your success. It's not going to contribute to our success. And so, a little more specifically, one of the companies that I talked with, Delta Companies, also here in Dallas, they're a healthcare staffing firm. They've got about 250 employees. One of the things that CEO Jeff Bowling told me is that a lot of times people confuse accountability with micromanagement. And
Hmm.
so what happens is if you see somebody not doing their job, you say, I need it, I need it, I need it. Well, that's not really helpful. What accountability really is coaching. I mean, it's
Hmm.
it's helping people become better. It's helping them reach their potential. And it could even be helping them to move outside of the company because they're not able to reach their potential in the company. But I think that what it really is being clear about what we stand for, being clear about what kind of performance we're expecting. And then when you have that clarity, then everyone knows this is what's expected of me. And it makes those conversations a lot, a lot less emotional, a lot less mean spirited, and it makes them helpful coaching conversations as
Right.
opposed to angry conversations.
Right. And talk to us about a little bit more about clarity. How does one, the alignment of having those values and clear objectives, having that clarity, how does one align people in their organization to gain that clarity?
Well, I wish we had a flip chart. I would draw you an inverted pyramid because what you have at the top is if you can imagine an inverted pyramid or an
Hmm.
inverted triangle, and at the top you have the vision. And the vision has financial metrics as well as non-financial metrics, like what does it take for us to be the best that would get your colleagues excited. And then the next level down, you have corporate objectives, which are milestones. The next level down, you have business unit objectives. the next level down, and so on and so forth until you get all the way down to individual objectives. And the point is twofold. Number one, all of these objectives have to cascade and have to fit like puzzle pieces, because what comes out at the bottom, if you say, okay, I'm going to take that inverted pyramid and turn it into a funnel, what comes out at the bottom is a result. And so
Hmm.
is it the result that we want, or is it a result that we find less favorable? And the litmus test for this, Tal, is the person at the very bottom of that funnel. So you've gone from the organization to departments down to the individual. The person at the very bottom needs to be able to walk out of their job every day, or at a minimum every week, and be able to answer this question: was today a successful day for me or not? And if they cannot answer that, then that's on the leader. The leader has failed to provide that clarity so that employees understand, hey, here's what, sorry, lights just went
There
off
we
in
go.
the office. Here's what a successful day, or here's what a successful week looks like. And that's the clarity that I'm talking about. And it's on the leaders to provide that, because I think, after all, most employees want to perform for leaders. Most employees want to be their best, and it's up to leaders to help them understand what the best looks like.
And you've got a really great sets of questions and tools after each chapter in your book. So I highly recommend, for those of you who are getting the book, this is, there is that triangle he's talking about. There is a wonderful, starting point for many leaders in their organizations, and expanding on that. In addition to that, the book has some really great questions that I've actually dabbled with in terms of our goals for 2015 in our organization, because they really gives you a clear set of expectations, and then you can go back and see, are we measuring up? Are we behaving according to those? Is that kind of the thought process, Greg?
Well, it's partly that, yes. The other thing is, everybody is in a different place on their journey, and so rather than me trying to be prescriptive, I think that the more effective way to do this is to pose a question. And so
Hmm.
some people will say, hey, that's a great question. That's going to cause me to do some thinking and maybe figure out how we can turn that question into some action. For other people, will say, been there, done that, check the box. So
Hmm.
I think the idea behind the questions, and these questions are all based on conversations that I've had with leaders, over many years, and they're questions that these successful executives have posed to themselves and to their colleagues. And so I think the idea is that, yes, you can take the question mark off and turn it into a statement, and it becomes an action that you want to pursue. And I think the other, what the book's role is to probe and to be thought provoking, and to pose questions that would cause people to think about whether or not that might make sense for them.
Yes, I agree with that completely, and that does apply, because everybody has different experiences and different point of view, and it's a great attribute that you mentioned earlier. That having those coaching conversation helps you get a little bit better clarity from the others, from the other person. Is that kind of in order to understand where they're coming from, where we're going together on this journey?
Well, that's an astute point that you have made, because the question that we should be asking ourselves as leaders, ultimately, it may come down to a conversation. Someone has not met our expectation, and I think it's our job first, as the leader, to determine the role that we played in that. So we should first ask the question of ourselves. The second thing that makes your point astute, Tal, is that I often ask leaders when I give workshops, if I were to walk in on this conversation that you're having, would I want to be there? Would it
Hmm.
would it be would it be a, would it be a conversation that would feel like a coaching session, or would it be a conversation where you're just simply taking somebody to the woodshed? Because if
Hmm.
you're just taking them to the woodshed, then that's really not going to be very constructive. I think the thought behind the conversation and the questions is that they should illuminate a couple of light bulbs. I think there's a light bulb that goes off in the person who was not meeting the expectation, to say, wow, I've really let the organization down, or I've let my colleagues down, or whatever the case may be. And when that light bulb goes on, then the boss, the supervisor, the leader can make a determination that, you know what, I think this person can be coached. Because if the light bulb doesn't go on for them, the light bulb that's going off in the head of the leader is to say, you know what, I don't think I should be spending any more time investing time in this person hoping it's going to get better, because the light bulb that's gone off for me is that they are clueless. They don't have the attitude, they don't have the will, they don't have the skill to get better. But hopefully the light bulb that's going to go off for everybody is, you know what, I've not been giving my best. Let's figure out what that needs to look like, and let's see if we can get it back on track.
So sounding like accountability has to do with trust.
Well, absolutely. Even though, you know, the root word of accountability is the word count. And so I think that it answers the essential question, can I count on you, right? Can I trust you? If I give you a job to do, can I trust you that you're going to do it? And by the way, accountability is a two-way street, which means that if I give you that job and you do it, you want to know if you can count on me. If I'm going to give you the raise or the opportunity to work on the next cool project, or, you know, hire that rock star that I need to flesh out my team so that we can keep on moving in a positive direction. So accountability is based on trust, and it's a two-way street. I want to know that I can trust you, that I can count on you, and you want to know if you do what I've asked you to do and met or exceeded my expectations. You want to know what's in it for you. And I don't think that's selfish. I think that's logical.
Well, one of the things that came up as I was listening to you is when I have that coaching conversation, which it creates accountability between two people, is to, if there's trust and I want to walk into this, what if happens if I walk into this, do I feel that there's trust between people, that they have a dialogue and they're vulnerable enough to say, look, I fell short. Here's what I'm learning. Here's what you can learn. Here's where you can get better. There's a little bit of a sense of, or an atmosphere of trust between one another, that someone is not getting defensive. Does that make sense at all?
Absolutely. In fact, one of the questions that I asked early on in the interviews that I did with these senior level executives was, I said, tell me what the difference is between a mistake and underperformance. And the mistake is, hey, I fell short, I screwed up, I didn't get it done, but I learned from that. It's typically what we would like to believe is that it's a single event. It's something that only happens once. We learn from it and we move on. The difference is underperformance is a pattern, which causes us, using your word, trust, it causes us to build up a bias of mistrust with that person. So you'd rather have an atmosphere or a bias of trust as opposed to one of mistrust.
Right. That makes sense. Let me flip over to something that I find people sometimes ask me in terms of a little bit of advice on, that happens sometimes, is a situation happens and the manager is underperforming, but the manager is underperforming has a hard time saying, I screwed up, or I'm taking, let me rephrase that, I'm taking responsibility for the results. I'm sure you can testify in your own experience how that works, and I find that it's happening quite frequently, unfortunately, where a manager has a hard time to just say simply, I take responsibility for X, Y, and Z. How do you see that, and where working with leaders and companies, how do you see that play, or do you sense the same? What's your take on that?
Well, there are a couple of points that I would make. I think it takes a strong person to admit a weakness. And so I think that when you find people that are not willing to accept responsibility, then I think that you've got a person who fundamentally is missing one of the key components of character, which is the first pillar in the 7 pillars of accountability. And I think that one of the mistakes that we make, and I certainly made it when I was running my own firm, is that I had a tendency to put more weight on hiring a person for who they were. In other words, tell me what you've done in your experience, as opposed to putting the weight on who you are, because who you are is going to be how you show up when things go bad. And so I think one of the points is to be able to create this culture, this environment that makes it safe for people to say, I'm confused, or I'm scared, or I've got a concern, or I've got two bosses that have two priorities that are conflicting, and I'm not going to be able to get them both done at the same time. One of the things that the airlines do really well, and I don't know, I fly a lot. I was on a plane a couple of days ago. I'm going to be on a plane tomorrow. And I'm always, where I can hear them giving the instructions for the exit row. And we know how that works, right? If you're sitting in the exit row, they will come by and they'll say, they don't expect you to read the little card, but they basically
Right.
say, are you willing and are you able, in the event of emergency, to open this hatch? And everyone says yes. I always say yes, and then I look for the big guy next to me to make sure that he can get it open. But the problem that we have as organizations, that we could learn from airlines on this, is airlines say, look, if you can't do it, or you don't want to, or you think you might injure yourself or whatever, we will reseat you.
Mm-hmm.
The problem that we have in our organizations is we don't have that upfront contract, so it gets really hard to reseat people. So I would say a couple of things. One, to the managers that are always doing the blame game, they're not, it was always somebody else's fault, or they weren't clear, or this, that, or the other. I would say, first of all, you might look at that and see whether or not this is a pattern in terms of, how this person is put together from a DNA standpoint. And the other, that you could say, okay, well, I'm not quite sure of that, but the one thing that I can be sure of is, let's have an upfront contract with what I call the if/then component. If you do this, then here are all the great things that will happen. It'll be the land of milk and honey, and we'll still love you, and
Right.
blah, blah, blah. And the flip side is, if you don't do this, then here's what will happen, and this may include, asking you to leave the organization. And I think that, again, without that clarity up front, it makes it really hard. It makes it pretty subjective to understand how we are going to hold someone accountable, because we haven't gotten that clarity up front. And I think that when we have that clarity, we're a little less likely to be scratching our heads and say, I wonder how we're going to approach this. I think that it gives us a lot more confidence in having those conversations. And I'm reminded with your example of the manager that says, it's not my fault, or somebody else did it,
Mm-hmm.
or whatever. This old African proverb that I love, that
Yes.
says, I take no joy that the hole is in your end of the boat, right? Because we're all in that boat together. So saying it's somebody else's fault, or another department, or I didn't know, or whatever, that's really not helpful. So I think the more we can get the right members in our clubhouse and be really clear about what the rules are, what the expectations are, and then when we track it, that's another one of the pillars. I believe that tracking does the heavy lifting of accountability. And a lot of times, my experience has been, when you're tracking it and you're putting it out on the walls and everybody sees, whether it's a departmental goal or an individual goal or whatever the case may be, what typically happens over time is that the people who are underperforming will either pick up the pace, or they will leave, because it's out there for all to see. And I think that if we take some of those steps early on, then the conversations are not going to be nearly as emotional, and it's not going to be nearly as uncomfortable for us to have when it comes to accountability.
Yeah, and I think that sometimes managers, I don't know if it's a mistake or how they were brought up, is they think of accountability as, documentation. I need to do verbal warning, I need to do written warning, and whatever happens after that. Is that a misconception of accountability?
Well, I think those are the three phases of unemployment, right? The three phases of unemployment are faith, hope, and charity, right? We hire them on faith. We hope they're going to do a good job, and we keep them on long after they've served their purpose. And I think that those kinds of, let's write them up, that's just 3 steps before we fire them. Again, I would come back and say, to me, the hardest question that any manager, any leader, any supervisor has to answer is, how much more of my time am I going to invest in this person? And I think, again, the first question that we should ask ourselves as leaders If someone is underperforming, the first question we have to ask ourselves in that is, what role did we play in that? Were we not clear? Were we not crystal clear on what it was that we expected? And again, as managers and leaders, our job should be in the barrier removal business. Our job is to remove those barriers that make it hard for people to be their best. And I think that if we've done all of those things, then we can have a conversation that may help us determine that maybe this isn't the right fit for this person. Maybe they got in over their head. Maybe they thought the job was something else, and that's okay to admit. Let's put them in a different position, which I've seen happen. It generally means, that person is going to make maybe a little less money. Certainly, it could be a blow to their ego. But I think ultimately, if they can admit to the fact that they're not having fun doing what they're doing, and we handle it with dignity, then they can move into a different position in the organization. Failing that, we need to move them out of the organization and help them find something that is more suited to their skill and to their temperament.
So that's fair enough. I completely. I have to say that your insights are very valuable. I've actually learned through this conversation so many key points to help me in my management style. So I can tell that our leaders in this community will take away from your insights. So thank you so much for being here this evening. I know we'll continue this maybe a couple of months down the line with a second interview, but I really want to appreciate your time and your wisdom tonight.
Thank you, Tal. Appreciate you having me this evening.
Great. So everybody, you get a chance to see it on another occasion. This is a taped interview, so you'll be able to see it on a blog post and share it in our community. Thank you and have a great evening.